I'm Paul Arthur. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. A phone call between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau results in a bit of tariff relief for the auto industry. Plus, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, along with other Canadian premiers, prepare their plans to deal with the tariffs. And local business leaders rally in Lethbridge for an integrated tariff response plan.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News.
Thanks for joining us. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made a phone call to U.S. President Donald Trump earlier today. On that phone call, Trump continued to claim that the reason for the tariffs is the flow of fentanyl and illegal migrants crossing the border, saying that Canada's efforts to curb the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. are not good enough. However, even U.S. reporters are questioning these apparent motives for U.S. tariffs.
And the president just posted on social media that he had spoken with Prime Minister Trudeau. He says he's not satisfied with what the Prime Minister has said when it comes to fentanyl, but less than 1%, as you know, less than 1% of the fentanyl seized last year was in the northern border. What else does Canada need to do?
Well, the president did just put out a statement on his call with the governor, Justin Trudeau, as he calls him, of Canada. And he said that he was not pleased, as you said. He said it's not good enough. He told Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that directly. The call ended in a somewhat friendly manner, as the president said, but he's not going to stop standing up for the American people.
Trump has since announced that after speaking with the big three automakers, Stellantis, Ford, and General Motors, Canada will get a 1-month exemption from tariffs for any vehicles coming through the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick says there could yet be more carve-outs of some kind on the way, hinting that meeting somewhere in the middle is a likely outcome for import levies on Canada and Mexico. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith held a press conference today to express disappointment with the U.S. tariffs and share the province's plans to counter Trump's measures.
So today I'm announcing the following measures in response to the actions of the U.S. president. First, I've directed my cabinet to alter our procurement practices to ensure the government of Alberta, along with our agencies, school boards, crown corporations, and all Alberta municipalities, purchase all needed goods and services from Alberta companies, from Canadian companies, and from countries with which Canada has a free trade agreement that is being honored. Second, no further purchases of U.S. alcohol or new VLTs will be permitted through the AGLC until further notice. We just have to drink a bit more BC wine and Alberta craft beer and spirits, and that's just fine with us. Third, I'm directing my government to assist our grocers and other retailers with labeling all Canadian products in our stores and ask them to voluntarily purchase their stock from vendors in Alberta, Canada, or countries that we share free trade agreements with that are being honored. Our government will also augment these efforts with a substantial advertising campaign to assist Albertans to more easily access information about where various products on store shelves are from. I understand as well that there's at least 4 apps that have been created in recent weeks and months that can assist Albertans in doing this. And fourth, my government will enter into free trade and labor mobility agreements with every province that is willing to do so. The goal is to have no exceptions, just free trade and free movement of Canadian workers right across our province.
Smith also stated that Canada has a secret weapon in the trade war called Alberta Energy, adding that whether or not the U.S. president chooses to admit it or not, they need our oil and gas today and will need it even more in the future as U.S. supplies start to dwindle. However, the premier has ruled out cutting off oil exports to the U.S. Meanwhile, Ontario Premier Doug Ford says there will be zero compromise on counter-tariffs, noting this attack was started by Donald Trump, not Canada. Ford says Canadian leaders need to be persistent, and he also brought up the issue of America's dependence upon Canadian rare minerals.
Just being persistent, and all the premiers really going down there and collaborating with their counterparts south of the border, as we have been doing, and I have endless calls right now that I have to follow up with the governors and some Congress people. But the deal is zero tariffs. We aren't going to budge. Or if I have to stockpile the nickel, high-grade nickel that their aerospace, their military needs, and I know on the average I said 50%, but some areas in aerospace are over 80% that they need our high-grade nickel, or be it our lumber, our aluminum, or our steel. There's a lot of areas that they need, but the number one area is critical minerals, and they can't get critical minerals anywhere else.
Canada's trade war with the U.S. has overtaken inflation as the biggest source of political concern for Canadians. A new Leger poll says 28% of Canadians believe dealing with President Donald Trump's tariffs and U.S. aggression is the most important challenge facing Canada today. The cost of living dropped to second place in the latest polling, with 21% of Canadians ranking it at their top concern, and that's followed by healthcare and housing affordability. In local news, a group of organizations in southern Alberta has launched a new economic initiative to enable success amidst U.S. tariffs, which will likely be disruptive to the provincial economy because the Alberta government relies so heavily on oil and gas exports to the U.S. for its revenue. BCN's Heidi Echevarria has the details.
Tariffs 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico, and that'll start.
This is going to be tough. The American trade war is going to hurt the Canadian economy and is going to hurt all of us. What our government needs to make sure we're doing is try to make sure that nobody goes hungry. So we actually have to fold back on the one thing he has said repeatedly, that what he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us, is the second half of his thought. Now, first of all, that's never going to happen. We will never be the 51st state. He can do damage to the Canadian economy. That's going to hurt people on both sides of the border.
As discussions surrounding tariff intensify in both the United States and Canada, experts warn of potential economic impact on Canadian markets. In response to these challenges, Southern Alberta is taking proactive steps with the launch of the Lethbridge Region Economic Resilience Task Force. Trevor Lubington, CEO of Economic Development Lethbridge, discusses how this new initiative is designed to bolster the region's economic resilience.
So the Business Data Lab at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce did identify Lethbridge as the 10th most vulnerable city in Canada to the impact of tariffs. And so, last year, Lethbridge exported about $2.2 billion worth of product, and that's mostly manufactured goods as well as value-added agri-food products, so it's not commodities. And 90% of all of that goes to the United States. So we're extremely vulnerable to the potential impact of tariffs. So that's why we need to come together. We've worked with 8 other community partners to bring together a coalition of the willing. So it's a number of like-minded organizations that are looking to really find solutions for industry in this region, support business. South Grow Regional Economic Development is here. We have Alberta Southwest. We've got the Lethbridge Construction Association. We've got Tourism Lethbridge. Ourselves as Economic Development Lethbridge. We've got both of our major post-secondary institutions, so the City of Lethbridge, Lethbridge County, Prairies CAN, which is Prairies Economic Development Canada, as well as the Travel Industry Association of Alberta. Yeah, interprovincial trade and advocating for removal of some of those barriers is a key part of the work. Now here's the frustration. In Canada, we've been talking about removing or reducing interprovincial trade barriers for decades. My hope is that this is finally the situation that motivates us to do something about it.
We have become over-reliant on trade with the United States. A substantial amount of the commodities coming from the rural areas are sold directly into the United States market. A lot of it, of course, is processed here and then sold on to the US too. And we've been talking for decades about diversifying our trade and our exports and the need to do that. The reality is that it's harder to do that than it is to just do business as usual. And with a friendly neighbor to the south with large markets, it's been easy to sell into the United States. And frankly, we've become over-reliant on that. I know the discussions around the board of directors for the South Grow Regional Initiative has been, this needs to be a wake-up call to proactively work for a long time on diversifying our export and trade ties with other areas of the world.
With tariffs now in place, Southern Alberta is now focused on future challenges, mitigating potential impacts and ensuring long-term economic stability. For BridgeCityNews, I'm Heidi Echevarria.
With wildfire season just around the corner, Alberta's Transportation and Economic Corridors Minister Devin Dreeshen gives us an update on highway projects in northern Alberta that will lead to better safety for Albertans.
We all remember the devastating impacts of wildfires in recent years. They have reinforced the urgent need for safe and reliable evacuation routes. That is why we are investing $311 million over the next 3 years to expand emergency egress capacity in northern Alberta. Now, this investment will ensure that people have new and improved options to escape dangerous situations quickly and safely. One of the most significant projects in this investment is the extension of Highway 686 between Peerless Lake and Fort McMurray. This project will add 218 kilometers of new highway, creating a critical east-west corridor in northern Alberta.
Coming off this week's conclusion of the Alberta Energy Regulators hearing on the Grassy Mountain coal mining project, a local panel featuring local representatives and experts will be discussing environmental concerns of coal mining in the Rockies on Wednesday night. Originally set to be a debate, toxicologist Mandy Alsgaard says she's disappointed that representatives from coal companies won't be attending.
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm actually quite disappointed. It originally started off with a debate, and there was supposed to be representatives from Northback, so like coal company representatives, representatives from the Coal Association of Canada. I was hoping we would get an audience that was representative of, this area and people who are looking for jobs from coal mining, people who are concerned about coal mining and how that could affect their jobs in agriculture. We have a good panel of strong experts in what everyone does, but again, it's almost just, I hate to use the pro-anti-coal, but it seems to be the people who are really trying to dig in and understand how coal is going to impact all the sectors in the area and the environment. And then we won't have that industry voice there to really talk about specifically about their mining, their operations, the technologies they're going to use. So yeah, I think it's an important panel. I think it'll share a lot of information, but I don't think you're going to have the representation from all the stakeholders there, which is unfortunate.
The panel discussion takes place Wednesday night at 6:30 p.m. at Southminster United Church. The city of Lethbridge is continuing to find ways to conserve water with the warmer months on the way. The city is requesting residents throughout the community and area to help in their efforts to conserve 20% of their typical water use. BCN's Landon Hickok has that story.
The city of Lethbridge is heading into their second year of their water conservation plan and strategy. As the population continues to increase in Lethbridge and as the city's water treatment plant nears capacity, Lethbridge is attempting to reduce 20% in water consumption throughout the city until the year 2030.
Because the potential drought that we were in, the drought that we were in, and the potential restrictions that we were looking at having to implement, the city actually responded really well to the voluntary mechanisms to reduce their water usage. And as part of that, we reduced about 15 or 16% from our water usage the year before, which is phenomenal.
The city's water treatment plant has an output capacity of nearly 150 million liters of water. Throughout the summer months, demand could surpass 130 million liters. The province announced in October of last year plans to expand the plant by an additional 30 million liters to 180 million.
We're going to do it in a couple phases. The initial phase is to build in some redundancy and a little bit of additional capacity into the system. And then we're going to look at building more capacity for the future. And then if needed, long-term vision is, again, to expand that capacity to be able to meet the needs not only just of the city, but more of a regional perspective as well. We are looking right now at the current upgrades in the next 2 to 3 years, and then the 5-year term, and then, like I said, that longer term vision is like 10 years out.
Reservoir levels are sitting at a much more higher position compared to this time last year. Snowpack from the mountains is just below normal levels, but greatly improved from this time last year. The city will continue to provide residents with regular updates on water conservation, current reservoir levels, and runoff forecasts.
In order for us to continue to grow, we will need to make sure that we have that water available.
From Bridge City News, I'm Landon Hickok.
A job fair was held today at the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Centre, in which over 70 employers participated. Service providers who came to receive applications included construction, manufacturing, social work, and occupational health. Barb Wollstonecroft, Career Centre Manager with Teamworks and organizer of the event, says more than 1,500 positions were offered at the fair.
Really trying to connect job seekers with local employers to get them employed, because we know employment is such an important thing for people's independence and self-reliance to get. When they have jobs, they're more self-directed and they have purpose. There's a lot of different positions where employers are struggling to find good qualified candidates. It's part of our grants that we have with the Alberta government, and we also offer training and employment services for job seekers, and so it's a great way to bridge that gap and connect employers and job seekers with jobs that are happening in our community.
Southern Alberta has lots of employees that are looking for opportunities, and we're looking for someone that would be a great fit for our company. Some really good connections with some of the people, and we're hoping that we'll have a couple people secured employment after this weekend. We're looking for great employees that are looking to work and grow their experience. We're a small company that's looking for people with the same values with us, with things like work-life balance and people who want to join the construction industry and work with people who are well respected.
Done lots of roofing, I've done construction, I've done janitorial work, and I do really good customer service. I work really well with other people. In Alberta, the employment rate is low, and like with the government and the tariffs and all the taxes, like people need jobs. There's lots of homeless people in Lethbridge.
Teamworks has been working with local job seekers for over 30 years. And a reminder, Miracle Channel is hosting a special fundraising event tonight entitled Heaven Focused. Special guest John Burke, author of multiple books on heaven, will join us, sharing stories of people's personal encounters with heaven. That's coming up tonight, right after Bridge City News at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Well, we saw a few showers mixed with some flurries today before the sun popped out again, but the rest of the week will be a treat. Stay with us. Jeanette Rocher will be back right after the break with a full look at the forecast.
Welcome back. Well, after a mainly overcast sky today with some light sprinkles, it looks like the rest of the week those clouds will be decreasing, making way for a beautiful bright blue sky and some lovely temperatures as well. So all of these temperatures over the next 7 days, we're seeing a higher than average for this time of year. So 6 for the high on Thursday. And then there's those double digits, 11 for the high on Friday, and then up into the teens for the lovely weekend there. 13 is the expected high on Saturday, 15 on a Sunday. Could that be a record breaker? Well, we'll have to wait and see. 8 degrees is the high for next Monday, and then a high of 6 degrees next Tuesday with a mix of sun and cloud for both of those days. So average high for this time of year, 4 degrees up from that 3 not that long ago. An average low -8. The record high on this day was 20 degrees. That happened back in 1987, and way back in 1947 was the record low on this day, which was -38. Sun rose this morning at 7:06, and our sun set this evening to happen at 6:20. So 4 minutes longer of a day than we saw yesterday. So 11 hours and 14 minutes of daylight. Okay, so sunshine on the west coast tomorrow, high of 11 degrees in Victoria. Could see 20 to 40K winds there, 30K winds around noon in Vancouver with a high of 9 degrees. Sunshine also in Edmonton and Calgary tomorrow. 6 is the high tomorrow in Edmonton and Calgary at an expected 7 degrees for the high. Okay, so a mix of sun and cloud expected in Saskatoon. Could see some fog batches dissipating though in the morning. 0 is the high there. Regina -2, could see a 30% chance of early morning flurries and a 60% chance of morning flurries happening in Winnipeg tomorrow with a high of -4. As we look into Toronto, seeing more precipitation, so 2 centimeters of snow expected there in Toronto, high of 1 degree. Could see a mix of some rain in with that snowfall. Ottawa also expecting some rain and drizzle in the morning, and could see some snowfall with that rain by the afternoon, high of 5 degrees. Montreal expecting 5 millimeters of rain tomorrow with 4 for the high there. Fredericton under a rainfall warning, could be seeing up to 40 millimeters by Thursday, but for tomorrow, for the most part, seeing 20 to 30 millimeters, and by the time it's all over, could see up to 40 millimeters by Thursday night. So 10 is the expected high. We're looking at 8 degrees there in Halifax. Halifax seeing 10 to 15 millimeters of rain, so lots of rainfall there as well. Charlottetown is seeing some showers there as well, 60% chance, 11 degrees for the high, and 2 degrees expected tomorrow in St. John's with a chance of flurries. Could see some rainfall mixed in with that as well. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
Canadian airlines and travel companies are seeing bookings to the United States plummet. Flight Centre Travel Group Canada says February bookings to American cities dropped 40% compared with a year ago. It says 1 in 5 customers canceled their trips to the U.S. over the past 3 months. Canadians appear to be rethinking their plans amid anger toward President Donald Trump and his tariffs, as well as a weak loonie. The dollar has hovered around 70 cents U.S. for the past few months. The group representing Saskatchewan car dealers says the cost of new and used vehicles will be going up almost immediately as a result of the U.S. trade war. President Donald Trump's executive order to impose 25% across-the-board tariffs on Canadian goods with a lower 10% levy on Canadian energy came into effect on Tuesday. Larry Heggs from the Saskatchewan Automobile Dealers Association says the cost to consumers will depend on a number of things, including where the cars come from. He says there's cause for concern, but not panic, as long as supply chains remain full and there's no shortage. Now, here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was up 298 basis points to 24,870. The Dow was up 485 points to 43,006. The S&P 500 was up 64 points to 5,842. And the Nasdaq was also up 267 points to 18,552. West Texas Intermediate oil was down $1.86 to $66.40 U.S. per barrel. Natural gas was up 12 cents to $4.47 U.S. Gold was up $4.15 to $29.1853 U.S. an ounce, and silver was up 73 cents to $32.65 U.S. an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.57 per bushel, barley is at $6.53, canola is at $14.40, and corn is at $8 even per bushel. Live cattle April contract was up $1.90 to $196.55. Feeder cattle March contract was up $2.25 to $276.10, and lean hogs April contract was up $2.35 to $84.70. And the Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours and currently sits at $69.80 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, after imposing 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods yesterday, Trump announced that after speaking with the big 3 automakers, Stellantis, Ford, and General Motors, Canada will get a 1-month exemption from tariffs for any vehicles coming through the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement. Coming up after the break, Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, reports on the impact of U.S. tariffs, the Alberta budget, and the investigation into AHS contract deals. When you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. You can also visit our website anytime to check out more of our stories and interviews. These are challenging times for Canada-US and Alberta-Canada relations. We'll dive into some of that now with our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, tariffs finally in effect now. It's interesting. Premier Danielle Smith, who was always big on diplomacy, right? Now she's saying she's fully supportive of the Prime Minister's retaliatory tariffs. So what gives there?
Well, everything is so up in the air right now over the course of the day today. Premier Smith talking about what she was going to do in response to the tariffs. You had all these conversations going on about the United States perhaps reducing some tariffs. It's really all in flux right now. And the interesting thing is yesterday, so Tuesday, the tariffs came into effect, and you'd pretty much every premier in the country, the exceptions being Premier Danielle Smith and I think Scott Moe of Saskatchewan as well, who immediately came out with their plans. A bunch of provinces pulled American liquor from shelves. A bunch of provinces announced income supports for businesses affected by the tariffs. You'd really sort of robust, I would say, response from the other provinces, and Alberta and Saskatchewan sort of waited their 24 hours to see where everything shook out. One of the big criticisms of Danielle Smith over the last few weeks, couple months really at this point actually, is that she's been doing all this diplomacy in the United States, talking to her counter governors in other states. She was at Mar-a-Lago a few weeks ago. There's this criticism that she was maybe sort of going rogue, not participating in this Team Canada response to things. And so it was very, very interesting to see on Tuesday when she put her statement out saying that, she fully sort of stands behind the Prime Minister. And so what gives? I mean, it's hard to say. My hunch is that there was this hope, I think, in Alberta political circles that this might be avoided. I mean, I think that hope existed in all political circles that this might be avoided. And, the rubber has hit the road, to use the cliche, and perhaps there is going to be a little bit of national unity for at least a period of time in response to these things. And especially because it is, as I say, so in flux. We don't know what's coming next. We don't know if things are going to change. We just have no idea. So and I don't think anyone has any particular insight. I mean, I don't think there's that much evidence that the Alberta government or the Ontario government has any different or better information than the federal government. So it perhaps does make sense for everyone here to sort of take a breath, take a step back, and sort of work on a unified response to this thing.
Yeah, at the time of this taping, we still haven't heard yet from Trump exactly, what kind of concessions may come today. He's hinted at, perhaps some carve-outs. So, would there be a carve-out for Alberta oil? I mean, who knows, I guess, and that would probably impact the way we respond here. To what degree will these tariffs impact the provincial economy? I mean, we're hearing some dire predictions, right?
Yeah, pretty significantly. In the budget last week, the Alberta government predicted, I think it was several thousand jobs this year, and then sort of 5-digit job numbers next year and the year after. I think the number that actually leaps to my mind is 2 years down the line is 46,000 jobs lost. So we're talking tens of thousands of jobs lost over the next 2-3 years if these tariffs stick around. Of course, they're interesting projections because there's no guarantee the tariffs will stick around, right? Even if Trump doesn't back down, we have midterm elections in the United States in 2026. If things go poorly in the United States economically, really good chance the Democrats take back both houses of Congress. And tariff powers actually are a congressional power. This is actually not a executive branch power in the United States. Donald Trump is using some sort of obscure kind of emergency act stuff, and Congress could actually amend legislation and put a stop to this today, in 15 minutes from now, if they so desired. So very good chance that we're not actually looking at tariffs 3 years down the road if the Democrats take back Congress next year, if the Democrats win the next presidential election. So, but all of that is to say it could be a very painful year, 6 months, whatever. So we're certainly talking significant job losses in Alberta, in other provinces as well. And then the big question sort of outside of job losses is, of course, what this does to the differential between Canadian oil and West Texas Intermediate. For whatever, I can't remember the exact number, but the Alberta government loses, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars every time the differential between Western Canadian Select, which is the oil we produce, and West Texas Intermediate, which is sort of the international benchmark. We lose millions of dollars every time that differential widens. So if there is a tariff on energy, it's likely that there's going to be perhaps a slowdown in purchases from Alberta, which would, of course, impact the bottom line for oil and gas companies. It certainly will impact government revenues. So, we've already got a deficit in this budget. We could be looking at reduced royalty revenues coming into the government. Certainly if there's job losses and an economic contraction, we're looking at lower income tax revenues, lower corporate income tax revenues all coming to the government. So there's some budgeting consequences that come out of this as well. And then of course there's whatever spending is done to sort of weather the storm, right? You know, if we think back to the COVID years, massive government expenditures, helping businesses, helping individuals, a lot of that federal funding, to be fair, but certainly an impact on the Alberta budget at that time too. So you can imagine a scenario in which the government has this contingency fund that they've set aside. Some of that, I believe it's about $4 billion. Some of that $4 billion could be spent on, you know, economic stimulus or subsidies or bailouts, things like that. So a whole pile of consequences that are sort of anticipated right now. But of course, we don't know what that's going to look like because we don't know what the final numbers are going to be. We don't know how quickly some of the markets might pivot. All very up in the air. But I mean, at the end of the day, the prediction is more or less that this is going to be bad for Alberta and bad for Canada.
Yeah, again, no one wins in a trade war. I just don't think that there's a winner. But now we haven't actually had a chance to connect with you since Alberta released its budget. You mentioned the budget here, so we're talking. I think it's a $5.2 billion deficit. It's big, you know. But you know, now there were some tax cuts as well. So do you want to just maybe share a bit of your thoughts on the budget?
Sure, yeah. So the tax cut's a really interesting one. You know, this was promised in 2023. The UCP had promised during the election to create a new income tax bracket below $60,000 where the tax rate would only be 8%, not 10%. This will save the average working Albertan, I think it's about $750 a year. So, you know, the average household, perhaps $1,500 a year if you've got, you know, sort of two income earners is where the math works out on that. But it's going to cost the government about $1.2 billion, which, you know, you just said the deficit's $5.2 billion. So it's not making up this entire deficit. But it certainly is blowing a bit of a chunk in the provincial government's budgeting. And you know what? I don't know if anyone anticipated it was going to come now. I think part of the reason why the Alberta government decided to go ahead with this now is if you can keep more money in people's pockets, that might lead to more spending. That might dampen some of the sort of recessionary effects of a trade war. But, you know, I think that a lot of people had thought, well, the time to roll this out is actually probably 2026, 2027, right before a provincial election. So I think a bit earlier than people anticipated, both from a political, tactical side of things and also from an economic standpoint. So the big sort of top line numbers obviously are that deficit number, that $5.2 billion, the tax cut costing $1.2 billion. It's a pretty big spending budget, generally more than $70 billion. Lots of money going to cities. In particular, Edmonton is getting a huge injection of cash to do a downtown development just adjacent to the arena. An increase in education funding as well. I think about 4.5% more in education funding this year. And that's also offset by actually a pretty significant increase in the education property tax right across the province. So people will notice that on their tax bills, their property tax bills coming up. Now that's going to vary by municipality, of course. But, you know, I think in Calgary, it's like an extra $390 or something like that for the average homeowner in Calgary. So big hits there. So you win some, you lose some in this budget, it looks like. But a very a tense budget, a budget that is making some cautious decisions. Not any really big spending cuts is the other thing that was notable here. You know, back in, must have been 2019, 2020, Premier Jason Kenney, they tried to sort of freeze the AISH budget. It's the insured income for the severely handicapped. Massive backlash to that. They de-indexed income tax, so it wasn't going up with inflation. Massive backlash to that. We're seeing some different decisions made this time around. And part of that, I think, is consciousness of this trade war. Part of that is consciousness that we're, believe it or not, only 2 years from an election.
Wow, time flies. Yeah, there was some increased funding for affordable housing and Indigenous housing as well, so there's some pros there. Of course, I mean, you're always going to get this. I don't think, it doesn't matter who's in power and what the budget is, but complaints from unions that you know, healthcare and education are being underfunded, even though, you know, there was some extra spending there. But of course, you also have to factor in, okay, the increased population. You know, that keeps happening in Alberta. People are moving here, right? So just again, so much uncertainty uncertainty there. Yeah, so now, if there's a bright side, I guess, to the U.S. tariffs, it might be that we're actually talking about building coast-to-coast pipelines. So, and that would really benefit Alberta. So who knows? It might, we might end up coming out on top of this one eventually. But of course, a big obstacle there is Quebec. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Quebec, and there's of course going to be some objection from some of the Indigenous groups in northern BC if the pipeline route was sort of discussed that way. It's a really interesting moment because everyone is talking about this. You certainly have some, I don't want to say consensus. You certainly have some enthusiasm in Atlantic Canada for some of these energy infrastructure projects. Certainly skepticism in Quebec, and you have had both Mark Carney, the liberal leadership contender, leading leadership contender, the guy who seems most likely to win the Liberal leadership, has certainly talked about this stuff a little bit. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, is certainly talking about this as well. What you don't seem to have right now is all that much enthusiasm from the private sector for it. There's talk of Keystone XL being restarted, for example. Yeah. President Donald Trump mentioned that the other day. And the pipeline subsidiary of TransCanada said, or TC Energy, I should say, said no, we're not interested. It's been chunks of it are decommissioned, and we're focusing on other projects. So you have all this talk. What does that look like on the ground? Are there private investors interested in it? Is it possible to do the negotiations, the consultations with Indigenous groups and route development, all these things? This talk is, I think, people are excited about it, but this is not a short-term sort of.
No, these things take a lot of years to put together, all these different hoops you have to jump through, the different people groups, we're dealing with here, and different governments and different provinces and so forth. Quebec, of course, is there some... hopefully some change of heart there, and there may be, with the tariff threats, et cetera. And so we'll see where that goes. I think and part of that is maybe, contingent upon who wins the next election, right? And again, certainly a conservative government would be, I think, more prone to saying yes to, hey, let's give this the green light. So we'll see what happens. There's got to be some sort of a field there, a playing field where businesses feel, okay, this is safe. We're not going to lose our shirts in this. Otherwise, why would you go ahead, right? So it needs to be in place there for sure. Now, the allegations of improper contracts with Alberta Health Services continue to make headlines. So UCP government appointing Raymond Wyant, a former Manitoba judge, to lead this investigation. He'll have a report apparently by the end of May, something like that. And so do you want to just briefly remind our viewers what's the main allegation in a nutshell here on the AHS stuff?
Yeah, it's sort of a complicated story. The gist of it is basically that Alberta Health Services was looking at contracting private surgical facilities to perform publicly funded surgeries. And the allegation is that there was pressure from within the government to sign contracts at an inflated rate, to sign more expensive contracts for some of these facilities. And there's some allegations of impropriety from within the Premier's office, that this may have, benefited someone who had previously, who was close previously with some folks in the government. So that's sort of the vague allegations here. But there, there's a lot of smoke but no fire to some extent. We don't know.
Right. Lots of allegations, but at this point, there's no hard evidence that's been presented. So getting lots of media coverage for sure, lots of talk. So it's being called a scandal. At this point, we don't actually know if it is or it isn't. Time will tell here for sure,
yes.
Right? So
and it absolutely blew up because the former CEO of Alberta Health Services sued the Alberta government, and that put all these allegations on paper in court. They could be reported on, and so the government has said basically a couple of things. We were unaware of any impropriety for a long time when these allegations were brought forward. We haven't seen any evidence, and also that the Alberta Health Services is sort of stymieing this transition to more private surgical facility kind of stuff. So it's all really complicated. But now, as you say, we do have this judge who ought to get to the bottom of it through a sort of inquiry. I believe the NDP is calling for like a full sort of public inquiry into this. The government doesn't seem to be going there yet, but this judicial inquiry should sort of get to some of the truth of this and lay out some of those facts.
Depending what he finds and how it's presented, I think is a big part of it. Of course, we had some resignations. Peter Guthrie, our infrastructure minister, resigning over this. He, doesn't like the way it's being handled. And Action MLA from Northern Alberta, Lesser Slave Lake, I believe it is, Scott Sinclair. He's really risking his career, I think. He's speaking out against the Alberta budget and says he won't vote for it, in its current form. So he's saying the budget does nothing for rural Alberta, favoring big cities, and it amounts to a provincial-style form of equalization. That's really interesting because, I believe MLAs are required to vote in favor of a budget-related bill because, you can, government can fall on these things, right? So, yeah.
It's certainly convention that government MLAs vote on their budget. And we are sort of conditioned in Canada in some ways to expect a lot of party loyalty on these things. And so it makes huge headlines every time you have someone in the backbench say sort of anything critical of government spending or anything that the government does. But yeah, this did sort of throw a bit of a bomb into the proceedings over the weekend, I think it was, when Sinclair said, who's this budget for? It's not for me. It's not for my constituents. It's not for my family or my friends, that kind of thing. And it is true, that there is a lot of funding for the cities. I mentioned that deal for the Alberta or the Edmonton downtown revitalization around the arena there. I think from the bean counter perspective, the majority of Albertans live in cities. And so it does kind of make sense that that's where a lot of that money ends up going. But on the flip side, you can certainly see why people in small town and rural Alberta would be upset about this. So bit of a political problem for Premier Danielle Smith in her caucus. This budget's not going to fail. We're not going to go into an election because, a bunch of rural MLAs
it's the politics, right? The massive support they get from rural Alberta, right? So in one sense, maybe you take them for granted and you need to make some headway in the cities, so you spend more money there. It's like, how do you navigate that, right? It's interesting to see how what the response will be from the Premier. Do you just let it go and give some freedom to your caucus to speak out and, it's a big tent sort of thing, or do you tighten the reins and prevent any rebellion? It's it's a fine line to row to hoe there. So I'm out of time here. Thanks so much, Tyler. Appreciate your feedback as always.
Always a pleasure to be here.
All right, Tyler Dawson, our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post.
How good is your memory? Do you still remember the SNC-Lavalin scandal that put Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on the hot seat? It was a pretty big deal back then, leading to the firings of former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, and a number of resignations and pressure for the Prime Minister to resign as well. Well, there may yet to be more evidence and prosecution brought forth. Our guest today is Duff Conacher. He is the co-founder of Democracy Watch, and he joins me from Toronto today. Good to have you with us, Duff. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, can you give us a little synopsis of what Democracy Watch is all about?
Democracy Watch is Canada's leading democratic good government and corporate responsibility advocacy organization, and we're pushing for key changes to make Canada the world's leading democracy and world leading corporate responsibility jurisdiction.
Okay, so for any foggy memories, can you maybe share a little bit of the backstory here? So remind our viewers what was alleged in the SNC-Lavalin case and where things finally left off.
Well, what was alleged was that SNC-Lavalin was charged and going to be prosecuted for bribing foreign government officials. And the Canada at the federal level has an independent prosecutor service, reports to the Attorney General, but the Attorney General can't intervene and stop a prosecution without declaring it in writing. And it can only be done for specific reasons. One of the reasons is not to protect jobs for a Canadian company. What was alleged was that the Prime Minister and other ministers in his cabinet, Prime Minister Trudeau, and other government officials at his direction we're pressuring the Attorney General to stop the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin, to intervene and do what's called a deferred prosecution agreement, which essentially says we won't do it again, but you don't end up with a criminal record. And those allegations came out through a whistleblower to the media, and then there were House of Commons committee hearings that exposed more. And as you mentioned, Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Attorney General, and the former Treasury Board Minister Jane Philpott kicked out of the Liberal caucus by Prime Minister Trudeau, and other resignations happened as well.
Yeah, and this went back, was it 6 years ago? I was thinking it was 3 years because it just feels like time flies, but 6 years ago. So since then, you have kept at it, and you finally got some information from the government on this case. So you filed an application with the Ontario Court of Justice to proceed with the private prosecution of Justin Trudeau for pressuring and directing others to pressure former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould to stop the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. Okay, so this goes back to 2018. So who is it who will make that decision whether you are permitted to proceed or not?
It will be a judge from the Ontario Court of Justice. And what's hopefully going to happen is that we have a hearing where we essentially summarize our evidence and make the case that the prosecution should go ahead with all the witnesses being heard and the evidence entered into court. At that point in time, an Ontario government prosecutor, Crown prosecutor, could step in and stop the case and take it over and either do the prosecution themselves or just stop it. So citizens have a right to file an application for a private prosecution, but the government Crown lawyers can take it over. And we're calling on the Ontario government to actually appoint a special prosecutor, because the Ontario government is currently a Conservative Party in power, and we don't want this tainted by any more partisanship the way it's been tainted so far through the RCMP's very secretive and negligently bad investigation and a very questionable decision not to prosecute anyone.
Mm-hmm. So you think there could be pressure on the courts not to proceed then?
Well, we just don't want to taint it with the Conservative Party in power in Ontario. The Attorney General who directs the Crown prosecutors, can give them instructions, is a Conservative. We don't want, and even the possibility of that Attorney General saying to the Crown, go ahead with the prosecution because it's prosecuting a Liberal. We want an independent, fully independent special prosecutor brought in. It's done in BC fairly often. It's been done in Ontario in the past. It's been done in the US regularly. And we need a really independent review of this by both the judge and also the prosecutor should also be fully independent, reviewing whether to take it over or let us as Democracy Watch go ahead with this prosecution.
Right. Now, you say that the evidence shows the RCMP did not do a thorough investigation. So I understand there were they only interviewed 4 of the 15 key witnesses. Is that right? And I think they hid key testimony from Wilson-Raybould and her chief of staff and her Treasury Board president.
Yes. First of all, they tried to bury it, and it took us. We filed a complaint under the Federal Access to Information Act and a request for all the investigation records in 2021, initially followed up again in 2022, and then we finally got all of the information out, 3,600 pages, just in the spring of 2024. So what those records show is that they're still hiding evidence. They're still hiding key parts that have been just blacked out of the interviews they did with Jody Wilson-Raybould and her chief of staff, who were the 2 people who were actually pressured the most by the Prime Minister Trudeau and other ministers and officials in his government. And also statements from Jane Philpott, who was a confidant of Jody Wilson-Raybould at the time. Part of her statements are also have been withheld. And it also shows, as you mentioned, only 4 of the 15 key witnesses were interviewed. They essentially relied on everyone else's public statements that they'd done nothing wrong. Well, of course, they're not going to say they broke the criminal code. And they didn't interview them or question them, and they also didn't try to get secret cabinet information that would show the internal communications about all of this pressuring. And without that evidence, you're really not completing your investigation.
Are you able to share a few key findings from your investigation as to what the RCMP interviews turned up that would seem to implicate guilt?
Yeah, so one of the key things people should remember, again, about the RCMP being so negligent in this, a lot of people don't know this. The RCMP commissioner, deputy commissioners, and head of every division are chosen by, through a secret process, and serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. They have no job security. They can be fired at any time for any reason. So we do not have an independent federal police force. And obviously you need one to be looking into anti-corruption cases. You cannot be RCMP commissioner serving at the pleasure of the Prime Minister while you're investigating the Prime Minister. So I think that's the key as to why they have been so negligent, and we need a new anti-corruption federal police force. What we were able to find in the 3,600 pages of investigation records they finally disclosed is, one, that there was a lot of pressuring. It was detailed in the interviews and the information they were able to get out, even though they didn't interview 11 of the key witnesses. And two, that they changed the standard by which to decide whether to prosecute for obstruction of justice, which is what the pressuring was doing. It was trying to obstruct a prosecution process, which is obstruction of justice. And they started with an initial standard that was correct. It's just whether you did it intentionally. And it was clear that the Prime Minister and others intentionally were trying to get the Attorney General to stop this prosecution. And they changed it to say, oh, you'd have to do it for a corrupt purpose. That's not the legally correct standard. And that's part of what we want a judge to look at, is that the evidence shows obstruction of justice and also breach of trust. And they didn't even consider breach of trust as part of their investigation.
So a change made to this legal standard of what obstruction of justice is. So who was it that you said made the change, and why was it changed?
It doesn't say why. They're just in the investigation records. They established that we got to establish that this was done intentionally, and then later on, when they're reaching their final conclusion, they suddenly say, "Oh, and we also have to establish that it was done for a corrupt intent." But that is not the standard for obstruction of justice. And as I mentioned, the other criminal offense of breach of trust, which is a violation of the criminal code, was not even considered by the RCMP, even though the situation very much meets all the standards of a breach of trust as well. And so that's what we're alleging, and we're asking for an open court hearing and to question and examine the RCMP's very questionable behind closed door secret decision that they tried to bury.
Okay, so if this case does go to court, is it within the realm of possibility that Trudeau could be found guilty of obstruction of justice?
Yes, we actually have an opinion from a retired Superior Court justice that said that the charge in the prosecution is warranted for obstruction of justice and likely also breach of trust. He is remaining anonymous, provided that opinion just to give us a sense of where we were at when we were looking at all the evidence. And we hope that we will get before an Ontario court justice and be able to proceed with this at the very least, because a fundamental part of having a democracy is this thing called rule of law. And what rule of law, what that means is that everyone has to follow the law. Doesn't matter how powerful or wealthy you are. And in this case, from all the evidence we see and the RCMP's behavior, they essentially let the Prime Minister off in secret, tried to bury it. And those decisions should not be made that way. They should be made in an open court with all the evidence and all the witnesses and testimony done openly and publicly so that everyone can judge it and a judge can issue a public ruling.
So if he is found guilty, what kind of a sentence could the judge issue to a former PM?
It's on a sliding scale, like pretty much all criminal code violations, of a fine and up to several years in jail. So there's no minimum. It would be up to the judge to decide based on the seriousness, from the judge's determination, the seriousness of the violation.
And realistically speaking, how successful are private prosecutions? What are the odds of winning a case like this?
Well, they have happened in Canada, mostly in the area of environmental law, where regulators have not taken big businesses to court and citizens have intervened after documenting pollution or some other kind of violation. It is entirely possible to go ahead and prove it. There's no different standards of evidence that have to be met when it's a private prosecution. The question is, will the Ontario Crown step in and take it over or stop it? And in this situation, we hope not, or if we hope that if they take it over, they'll proceed with it, and we'll get the open court hearing that we want. This is an unprecedented situation. I'm sure our attorney generals have been pressured in the past by prime ministers to stop prosecutions of friends of the prime minister. It's just never become public. And that's why it's so outrageous that the RCMP did not go to court over this and let a court decide, because they would never have been able to know whether the court would find Trudeau guilty without actually testing it in court. And they shouldn't have made a very questionable secret decision to let everyone off.
Okay. Do you think that Canada needs some form of like an anti-corruption agency that is completely independent to police our politicians?
Yes, as I mentioned, the RCMP commissioners, deputy commissioners, heads of every division, chosen by and serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. That's not independent. As well, we have, for money laundering, people may have heard of this agency called FinTrack, which is supposed to be tracking money laundering through financial institutions. And the head of FinTrack, also chosen by and serving at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. So we do not have a rule of law, an independent, effective enforcement system for corruption. And we need a new, fully independent anti-corruption police force and a team of fully independent prosecutors so that we finally get prosecutions in these kinds of cases instead of people being let off in secret.
Mm-hmm. And Duff, do you also believe Canadians deserve to see a public inquiry into this SNC-Lavalin affair?
The House Committee revealed a lot, but the House Committee has also questioned the RCMP about how they arrived at their conclusion not to prosecute anyone. And the current RCMP Commissioner, Michael Duhem, promised to disclose all the internal communications to a House Committee last year. And he didn't. He sent a vague letter that was a couple pages long that didn't explain one of the key things with the RCMP. They received a final investigation report from the investigating officers in March 2021, and they sat on it till January 2023 until we forced it out and finally got full disclosure in June of 2023. So why did they sit on it for 1 year and 9 months? What were they trying to do? Who made the final decisions? All of these questions are still unanswered, even though we've been digging into them for the past 3 years. And it's really outrageous that the RCMP is operating this way and trying to cover up a situation instead of enforce the law properly.
We're out of time here, but thanks so much for being with us today, Duff. Appreciate having you on.
My pleasure. Thank you for your interest.
Duff Conacher is the co-founder of Democracy Watch. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.